Good afternoon and welcome to today's meeting of the LaRouche organization. The topic, on the brink either of war or of peace through development. Now, while people this week were being encouraged by so-called independent media to look elsewhere at the various judicial sideshows, whether that was Jussie Smollet or Ghislaine Maxwell, the world's actually stood poised to walk another few steps down the ladder into thermonuclear hell. What actually happened in the 2-hour exchange between Russian President Vladimir Putin and President Joe Biden, who was accompanied by two chaperones, Anthony Blinken and Jake Sullivan? Well, those who believe that thermonuclear war is unthinkable may have a problem with thinking. Many commentators are talking about how each side was manipulating the circumstance in order to get a concession from the other, and that there were manufactured crises in order to have some sort of negotiation. That really ignores the reality, the physical reality of what has been going on in Ukraine, what's been going on particularly since 2014, when the United States, with the country agent in that case being Victoria Nuland, staged a coup in Ukraine, which was run by intelligence agency forces, as Victoria Nuland stated at the time, with over $5 billion spent on that occasion. And the later reactions of people in Russia and so on were to that reality. What's needed here is a set of discussions and a formulation of an approach to stepping humanity back from the brink of a civilization-ending war. Yes, people are saying that that's not likely. But then again, wars by miscalculation are very, very well known in history. Lyndon LaRouche, back in 1985, speaking to the Schiller Institute in December of that year, shocked the audience by basically posing a kind of task to them that very few in the audience had ever heard posed to them before. We're going to show you an excerpt from that.
As an address and paper to the recent Schiller Institute conference in Rome on St. Augustine. I shall address that to the questions which predominantly, but not exclusively, those of you from the United States must face and face efficiently during the coming year. While only a few of you, and almost none of those outside this room in the United States, presently understand this fact, the fate of civilization on this planet, not only for today and tomorrow, but the fate of the attempt to build civilization in Europe over more than 2,500 years will rest, will fall, or prevail on the basis of what is done during 1986, and in the greatest degree upon what is done within this fading, collapsing, rotting superpower we call the United States.
Now, that next year, during 1986, in Reykjavik, Iceland, Mikhail Gorbachev and Ronald Reagan declared, after much wrestling back and forth, that a thermonuclear war could under no circumstances be won and must therefore never be fought. Some have noticed that in June of this year, 2021, that Vladimir Putin and President Biden reaffirmed that statement that was made 35 years ago in Iceland. Why did they do that? What has been happening in the world this year that has caused that to need to be stated, and what's going on right now this week that is further destabilizing the world perhaps even leading us down the pathway to thermonuclear annihilation. To discuss that and to discuss the remedies for that, we have two people today. Harley Schlanger, who is always with us. He's a spokesman for the LaRouche Organization, and Paul Gallagher, who's co-editor of Executive Intelligence Review. So we're going to start, first of all, good to see you guys, with Harley. Go right ahead.
Okay. Hello, everyone, and thank you, Dennis. The question that I want to take up is that following the Biden-Putin summit on Pearl Harbor Day, it appears as though there's been somewhat of a de-escalation. We were clearly at a moment of incredible tension, which was largely built up by an intense psychological warfare campaign coming out of Washington, coming out of the City of London, and out of Brussels, out of NATO, with talks of Russian troops on the border, a Russian offensive being prepared. On December 3rd, there was a leak from the intelligence community that was in the Washington Post saying various figures, 170, 180,000, maybe 250,000 Russian troops on the border, and no one knew what Putin was planning. But they assumed that he was planning an invasion. And the talk said that between the end of January and mid-February, there might be a Russian invasion into Ukraine. Now, from reports on the summit that occurred, the video conference, it does appear as though a bit of a de-escalation is underway. So the question has to be asked then, why is Helga Zepp-LaRouche saying that we are still sitting on a powder keg? And that's what I want to discuss in my presentation today. I mean, what we know from the discussion that took place at the summit is that both leaders said what they wanted to say. Putin said his piece, making the case for Russia's concern about NATO expansion, the violation of the pledge made in February 1990 that there would be no eastward expansion of NATO. He wanted a written guarantee that would occur now, no further eastward expansion, concern with the military buildup of NATO in Ukraine, and also the asking for Western guarantees to live up to the Normandy format of the Minsk Accord, which would have included a Ukrainian commitment to discussion of what's going on in eastern Ukraine, which the Kiev government has refused to do. That's what Putin mentioned. Biden put his piece forward. You should not invade. We're not going to accept it. We don't accept red lines. There will be serious consequences if you do invade Ukraine, especially economic consequences. And there's a unified NATO that's committed to defend the sovereignty of Ukraine, which is interesting because one wonders where that defense of Ukrainian sovereignty was in February 2014, when the US, the British, and NATO pulled off a coup against a democratically elected government. But Biden, for his part, then said the U.S. would not launch a strike, would not attack. And then he said the U.S. would engage in what was later called a larger diplomatic outreach with Putin, our European allies, and Ukraine to discuss Putin's concern, especially with NATO deployment, NATO enlargement, and the Normandy format diplomacy. Now, also, it's the case that there are continuing progress being made by diplomatic working groups that were set up from the Zurich summit between Biden and Putin. Working groups taking up questions such as the INF treaty, deployment in Eastern Europe, the situation around the Black Sea, and so on. And these diplomatic working groups also include networks that one of the people involved in it is CIA Director William Burns, who is somewhat trusted by the Russians as a senior figure. Burns himself said that in contrast to those people who asserted that we know Putin wants to invade, Burns repeatedly said we don't know that Putin intends to invade. We don't have any clarity on that. And he also said that there are fewer troops than have been reported. I think he said there are 70,000 not 150 or 250,000 troops. And he did say that the continuing dialogue would go on with the working groups. But with all that said, pointing toward a de-escalation, the U.S. is continuing flights, and NATO are continuing flights along the Russian border, including with nuclear-capable bombers, that is, bombers that can carry nuclear weapons that are within a few minutes of Moscow. There are also naval maneuvers in the Black Sea, a NATO buildup overall, including Poland, the Baltic states, and weapons being delivered to Ukraine. And then on top of that, some highly provocative comments that seem to go against the idea of de-escalation, including from some of the people who were there with Biden, such as Secretary of State Blinken, who every chance he gets talks about serious economic consequences, high risk action for Putin if he does do anything, and especially talks about Russia's violations of the rules-based order. Now, on top of that, then you have voices coming out very clearly for war with Russia. Most prominent was Senator Wicker, the number 2 man in the Senate Armed Forces Committee, Wicker from Mississippi, who said that if Russia doesn't back down, we should stand off with our ships in the Black Sea and rain down destruction on Russia. He said, I would not rule out troops on the ground. And he said, we don't rule out the first use nuclear option. This from a senator who's high of importance in the Senate Armed Services Committee. You have Ted Cruz, who's known to shoot off his mouth without thinking. But Cruz said that if Putin invades Ukraine, it's Biden's fault. And he said the reason is Biden surrendered on Nord Stream 2, the pipeline that provides natural gas, once it's certified and open, from Russia to Germany and Western Europe. And he also said that Biden waived the sanctions on Nord Stream 2, which is why Russia is now encouraged that they can do what they want. Now, I could say more about Nord Stream 2. I mean, basically the idea, if you sanction Russia and don't allow the gas, who are you punishing? You're punishing our Western allies, especially Germany. In Germany, we're experiencing a very cold early winter. We're moving away from nuclear technology, moving away from coal. If you shut down natural gas, and you already have 40 to 50% increase in utility costs in Germany, what you're doing is starving, or rather freezing, one of our allies. So how is that an effective punishment of Russia? And by the way, Ted Cruz, who never stops talking about his commitment to free trade, one wonders where that stands when he endorses these kinds of sanctions. 22 House members from both parties called for sanctions against Nord Stream 2 and also called for delivering defensive lethal weapons to Ukraine. Victoria Nuland, the notorious State Department operative who was on the scene at the Maidan Square in 2014, a major coordinator with Joe Biden, and by the way, with Blinken as well, in the Maidan Square massacre that led to the regime change in Ukraine in 2014, under questioning from Marco Rubio, another war hawk senator from Florida, Rubio said there are 3 points he wanted to make. We should not pull back NATO forces from the Russian border. We should not rule out admission of Ukraine and Georgia to NATO, and we should not stop arming Ukraine. And he asked Nuland if she agrees with that, and she said absolutely on all 3. Then you have Michelle Flournoy, who was slated to become Secretary of Defense under Biden until it became clear that she was nothing but an operative for the military-industrial complex. She was explicit in calling for Russia to be kicked out of the SWIFT system, which is the safe and secure financial transaction system that if Russia were kicked out of, it would probably have a profound effect on Russia, but also the whole financial system, as I think Paul may be talking about, is extremely fragile and weak right now and could trigger across-the-board defaults. And then, of course, you have people like Adam Schiff and the anti-Russian crowd in the Democratic Party who came out saying you can't trust Putin. And Schiff in particular praised the idea of the Summit for Democracy as necessary to counter Putin. And I'll talk about that in a moment, the Summit for Democracy. But it's worth noting there were voices speaking out against war. And this is significant because until recently, there had been very few voices warning of the danger of nuclear war. One of the most important international voices raising that question has been Helga Zepp-LaRouche, the founder of the Schiller Institute. And what Helga has been warning is that these kinds of this kind of rhetoric and these kinds of deployments, the constant crisscrossing of borders and flying up to the airspace of other countries with nuclear-capable bombers, it's a small accident away from triggering a response which could lead to a nuclear war. She'd been one of the few voices raising that repeatedly. But in the aftermath of the recent buildup, the December buildup toward war, the psychological warfare exercise conducted by intelligence services in the transatlantic region, Tulsi Gabbard spoke up once again. And she said that anyone saying what Senator Wicker said about preparing a first strike nuclear attack must be, quote, insane, a sociopath, or a sadist, unquote. I would say all three. But then she made the point, he's not an outlier. He's the number 2 person in the Republican Senate Armed Forces Committee. That the same language is coming from Democrats and Republicans in Congress, she said, as well as from some in the administration, as well as from the media. And she concluded her comments saying, we're being pushed closer and closer to a hot war, a nuclear war, by the same neocons and neoliberals in Washington, responsible for the regime change wars in Iraq, Libya, and Syria. Now, one of the places she said this was on Tucker Carlson's show on Fox, and Carlson echoed Helga Zepp-LaRouche, saying, no one should think that a nuclear war is not possible. Now, there's another reaction that's occurred since the summit, and we're just beginning to get a reading on this, but it appears as though there's a certain amount of panic in British circles. What if Biden actually does pursue diplomatic compromise or diplomatic agreement with Vladimir Putin on these questions that are driving us toward war? And this was reflected in a headline in the Daily Telegraph, one of the leading war publications in the City of London. The headline was, Biden's offer for talks to avert Russian invasion is a big win for Putin. And that's a talking point among Republicans, including Donald Trump. And then there's an Intel News, which is a business publication, which said, Putin wins concession from Biden. So you have these kinds of comments coming out, and I'll just point out one other one. Annalena Baerbock, the new foreign minister in Germany, who seems eager to put forward the idea of a nuclear-capable Germany stepping up to defend freedom in Ukraine. She's from the Green Party, which was once a peace party, but which is now identifying itself with the most extreme war hawks in the West. And this is a very ominous development, which seems to go against Germany's tradition of not encouraging war, given its location in Europe. Germany is not that far from Ukraine. Now, with this as a background, let's take a look quickly at this stunt that was carried off the last couple of days called the Summit for Democracy. And I say it's a stunt because really it's a cover for what you might call a new wrinkle in British geopolitics. The key to British geopolitics is a division of the world into two empires. This is what they did after World War II. the idea of the US and NATO versus Russia, the Soviet Union, and the Warsaw Pact. When that collapsed with the collapse of the Soviet Empire in 1990, what was put forward was that we could now have a unipolar world in which the power of the West, the transatlantic, especially in the hands of the United States and NATO, would be the determinant of all policy in the future, economic policy, strategic policy, and so on. The idea of a unipolar world, a unilateral decision-making process which every other country had to adhere to. This is really the origin of the modern conception of the rules-based order. There are no real rules in it because the so-called rules that are defined by international treaties, the United Nations Charter, and so on, are repeatedly rejected by the policies of the transatlantic powers, particularly the United States and NATO, in launching the endless wars that we've been seeing. But the division of the world into two camps now, the Summit for Democracy basically says you have the democratic world and then you have the autocrats, the authoritarian regimes, including Russia, China, Iran, Nicaragua, Venezuela. They identify a few others. And they invited 130 or so countries to this summit, including a number of countries which are not exactly very democratic. Where did this come from? Well, I've been doing a little digging on it, and the origin seems to be from the State Department policy planning staff in 2008. The idea was first presented then. Now, of course, that was the end of the Bush regime, when George W. Bush famously said after 2001, after the terror attack of 9/11, you're either for us or against us. That's the division of the world. You either join our fight against terrorism or else you're with the terrorists. Now, that included endless wars, but it also included the establishment of a security state or a surveillance state imposed on the so-called democracies. So it's from that background that this idea initially came up that maybe we should have a further redefinition of the unilateral order. Now, part of the reason for this and the impulse for it came as we're seeing a decline of the power of the United States because of the economic collapse that's been underway for many, many years, as forecast by Lyndon LaRouche in 1971, and then again in the mid-1980s when the Soviet Union rejected his proposal for the SDI, and he forecast the fall of the Soviet Union. And when the Soviet Union fell, he said, if the US doesn't change its ways, its financial system and its economy will collapse. And we're seeing that happening now at the same time that China is emerging as a competitor, according to the Warhawks, but as a very strong global economy, which does not accept the unipolar world. Now, in the State Department, one of the people in that policy planning group was a guy named Ash Jain. And he later went from the State Department to the Atlantic Council. The Atlantic Council is a think tank which was set up to coordinate U.S.-British policy, I think in 1961, funded by all the military-industrial complex firms, the defense contractors, the corporate conglomerates, and it's essentially has a very large staff. And according to someone I spoke to there, there's a lot of interaction with MI6. You have rotating positions from British intelligence into the Atlantic Council staffers. Now, in 2014, Ash Jain launched a project called the D10 Strategic Forum. D10, a reference to the G7, plus Australia, India, and South Korea. Note that two of them, India, a former British colony, although India does stand on its own as a sovereign nation, but Australia is part of the Five Eyes. The idea was that you can't do things within the UN Security Council because China and Russia have a veto. The United Nations is too large and awkward to have some kind of policy platform to defend the rules-based order. The G7 is too small. The G20 is too mixed. So you need a new platform of approximately 30 core countries, which are the world's leading democracies. And what they defined was as the basis for membership is shared values and interests, as well as defining the countries that, quote, possess the requisite diplomatic, economic, and military resources to act on a global scale, unquote. Now, this was brought to the G7 summit this June in England when Boris Johnson said that the G7 should move toward the D10. And he called it his D10 initiative. And at the time, he stressed bringing in India, Australia, and South Korea. Now, let me just give you an insight as to who one of the leading promoters of this D10 is at the Atlantic Council. A former U.S. ambassador named Daniel Freed spent 40 years at the State Department. He was ambassador to Poland. He was a coordinator of Eastern Europe policy. From 2013 to 2017, he was the coordinator of sanctions policy for the U.S. government. And he said that he, along with Blinken, was involved in putting forward the sanctions against Russia after Russia's response to the Ukraine coup in 2014. He's very proud of that. And he said he worked closely with Biden, the Biden team, with Nuland and Blinken. Now, this whole idea of the D10 is that the countries that don't accept the rules-based order have to be cut out on trade, on economics, with sanctions, with a policy which punishes them for their authoritarian ways. Now, Dr. Andrei Kortunov of the Russian International Affairs Council asked an interesting question. He said, how is it democratic to insist there's only one development model which is acceptable? This is a return to the Project for a New American Century, the PNAC unilateralism, that the West prevailed in the Cold War, and this is the only acceptable model. Well, that model's collapsing now. The model is based on a free trade policy, which is destroying the advanced sector countries even as it's escalating the looting of the poorest post-colonial world. We see the same unilateralism in the Glasgow Climate Summit, the idea that everyone has to accept zero carbon-based policy, even though the science is fraudulent and the result will be the lack of energy to power the advanced sector countries, but also as leaders from Africa, from India, from Indonesia, and other countries said, this is a new form of colonialism, carbon colonialism. And ultimately, the other aspect of this is that it eliminates the idea of national sovereignty. And that's what the Great Reset is about. You're putting in the hands of central bankers the power not only to control financial flows and monetary policy, but spending policy. This is being enforced by a compact of bankers organized by Mark Carney, the former governor of the Bank of England, in which they say that if you invest in any industry that has a carbon footprint, you'll be cut off, that the credit will be shut down to construction companies, to transportation companies, to power companies that produce carbon dioxide. This is a dictatorship. How is this democratic? Now, one further question to ask then. These are the initiation of this, the United States, the British, and NATO. These are the countries which have been engaged in one regime change after another in the last 2 decades, going back to the reaction to the attacks on 9/11. Regime change in Afghanistan, where when the U.S. finally left after 20 years, the country is in a shambles. And instead of helping to provide for people who were victims of 40 years of war, the U.S. is holding on to $9.5 billion of money that belongs to the Afghan people while you have millions facing starvation, a cold winter. How is that democratic? You have the regime change in Iraq, the regime change in Libya, in Ukraine, the attempted regime change in Syria. Are these examples of democracy? So I just wrote an article talking about this as the summit of hypocrisy. But what's especially important to realize is that the people who are running it are people who are trying to sabotage any potential for positive negotiations and cooperation between the United States and Russia and the United States and China. And if you look at the language that's used at this summit against Putin in particular, that he's an authoritarian, he's against democracy, he's against free speech, he's shutting down opposition political parties. Well, let's look at the United States. The best example of this kind of authoritarianism was the treatment given to Lyndon LaRouche, the best economic forecaster of the last 50 years, who consistently intervened globally to provide an alternative to the collapsing financial system, which is on the verge of implosion today. He was constantly slandered. Our publications were shut down. Our writers were put in prison. Lyndon LaRouche was imprisoned. And there was nothing but a vilification and slander regime against him for his lasting till the day he died, including in the obituaries that were written at the time of his passing. That's democracy. And then let's look at another case, that of Julian Assange. The High Court in Great Britain just certified that he will be extradited to the United States. And the Biden administration is continuing to insist on that extradition. What crime did Assange commit? He published documents showing actions of war criminals in the US military and intelligence community. It's the war criminals who should be put on trial. If you're an actual democracy, you don't punish the whistleblowers. More whistleblowers were punished under the Obama administration, and many of those in around Biden today were veterans of that Obama administration. So the Assange case and the LaRouche case in themselves demonstrate the fraud of this idea of the Summit for Democracy. Now, how do you deal with this? Well, we can talk about this in the Q&A, but at the same time, Mrs. LaRouche warned that we're still sitting on a powder keg. She made a very important point. We need more voices with the courage to address this war threat. Don't worry about people saying you're an alarmist. This is using fear. The use of fear is to convince you that you have to submit to this unilateral system, which is driving us to the brink of war, including nuclear war. And so individuals like Tulsi Gabbard should be encouraged. But what of all the other people in government, in institutions, who are aware that this policy, if it's carried out, could lead to nuclear war? They have to come out, and we have to encourage them. We need a movement that addresses this fraud in the name of democracy, which is actually a policy of war. So that's basically what I wanted to present today.
Okay, thanks a lot, Harley. And actually, what I think we're going to do is bring something up now from Lyndon LaRouche, which deals in part with the matter that you were dealing with at the end concerning the democracy or hypocrisy conference that just occurred. This is again from Lyndon LaRouche from 1985 from his St. Augustine conference. And I think perhaps after Paul speaks, Harley, you may want to make a comment on this.
The question here is not a question of being like Aristotelian commentators or the oracle of Delphi, to give oracles, paradoxical oracles, which will tell you as contemplators what the prophets will tell you will happen to the United States. We are not writing Lower Greek tragedy. The question is an eminently practical question. What difference does your personal existence mean for the outcome of the entirety of human history and existence during 1986? And I do not exaggerate. In a true republic, the true citizen of a true republic is personally accountable to the Creator for the outcome of that republic, for the outcome of the general welfare as it affects all persons in that republic, of the outcome thus of every personal life in that republic, and the outcome of the role of that republic in the world for the welfare of humanity as a whole and of every individual personality, present and future, of humanity as a whole. The individual citizen of a republic is personally accountable to the Creator to the extent that that individual either has the capacity to influence the course of events or can develop the capacity needed to influence the course of events.
And that's the conception of self-government, not mere democracy, that the United States was actually founded upon. It's also the conception that we are advocating here, and it's the conception that is opposed by those forces globally that are doing that. But rather than merely concentrate, as we have so far, on the immediate circumstances of conflict, the strategic military side of that, we want to turn now to something a little bit deeper. And Paul Gallagher, co-editor of Executive Intelligence Review, is going to take that up. So, Paul?
Okay, thank you. I want to add the point to this presentation, this discussion, that the drive to impose what's usually called the Green New Deal itself on, in particular, the economies of the transatlantic countries, the ones involved in NATO, that drive in itself is intensifying the danger of war. In fact, it's a spear point of that war danger. And for that reason, we need to fight that imposition of the Green New Deal, not only to save economies and populations, in particular in developing countries, but also very much so here. But we need to fight it also as part of our effort to organize the leaders of nations away from this war confrontation. So I start by just pointing out the following, that this very grandiose 13-day economic summit, the World Climate Summit, as it called itself, in Glasgow, Scotland, in November, that was called COP26. That was publicly acknowledged by its British and U.S. leaders to have broken down, to have failed. And it was a failure that was that President Joe Biden and others angrily blamed on Chinese President Xi Jinping and Russian President Vladimir Putin immediately at the end of that summit. And extraordinarily, within 3 weeks of that, what came to be called the Flop 26, because of the clear failure of it, its coordinator in the British government wound up crying about it in his final speech to the delegates there. But that clear failure within 3 weeks had led to and ratcheted up a U.S.-Russian confrontation over Ukraine, to the extent that claims were being made that and they were being made throughout NATO, that a Russian invasion was imminent, that it was virtually certain. And there were warnings being made by others that a second inadvertent Cuban missiles crisis was in the works, like the crisis which terrified the entire world in October and November of 1962. Within 3 weeks of that failure, consider, for example, and Harley has referred to this in part, the feature of the new German government, which most causes the greatest concern among European elected officials and others in other countries in Europe. The German government's two most drastic Green Party environmental extremists are also its two leading warmongers. They are the foreign minister, Annalena Baerbock, and the energy, economics, environment super minister, Robert Habeck. Baerbock, Harley has already talked about. She campaigned for the chancellor and lost on a strictly anti-Russian, anti-Nord Stream pipeline, pro-Ukraine, defend the Ukrainians against Russia on that platform. She's now the foreign minister. Habeck put on army fatigues and went into the so-called front lines in the deconfliction zone in eastern Ukraine, more or less to urge on the Ukrainian troops who were at that time shelling the two Russian-speaking semi-autonomous republics in the Donbass region. This is not exactly the job description even of an environmental super minister like Habeck, but it is the character of these two ministers. Now, on one hand, they're anti-carbon climate extremists. They demand the sacrifice of populations and economies, reliable power, heat, livestock growing, farming, and so on, to sacrifice all that to, quote unquote, the planet. On the other hand, they demand war preparations and diplomatic and military confrontations with Russia and China, two of the major powers, two of the major nations that refuse to sacrifice their economies to the planet. And if this military confrontation means, at best, that Germany itself and other West European countries will be deprived of natural gas for heat this winter, having already been deprived of nuclear power, on track to get rid of coal, then that doubly meets the objectives of the Greens. They want low energy use, among other green policies, and the lowering of population that goes along with them. You might say that these extreme Greens are the most imperialist of the groups and parties there in Germany and in Europe. They follow the political traditions of Henry Kissinger's 1974 National Security Memo, NSSM 200, which was written around the stricture that the developing countries could not be allowed to use their own resources, especially not in cooperation with the then Soviet Union. And this warlike antagonism against anti-Malthusian nations is also, of course, true at higher levels than these two new German ministers. The Atlantic Council, which Harley described in thoroughly, the think tank side of the NATO alliance, it broadcast from beginning to end, it webcast from the failed Glasgow Global Climate Summit right up to the bitter end on the 13th day. And you could also look at the Royal Institute of International Affairs, or Chatham House, which in the earlier conference, January of 2021, of the World Economic Forum, the so-called Great Reset Conference, where the World Economic Forum promoted the Green New Deal. At that conference, Chatham House, the Royal Institute, took the lead from the World Economic Forum in designing policies it effectively rolled out a series of policies to compel low carbon production of steel, low carbon production of cement, low carbon farming, meaning no livestock raising, and so forth. Policies which raise production costs and lower quality, lower productivity and production throughout the most basic industries. I'll give an example very shortly of exactly what this meant immediately after that failed climate summit, of what was imposed on Germany in opposition to China. So in June, this same Royal Institute of International Affairs co-sponsored with the International Energy Agency a conference which was called The Implications of Net Zero 2050 for Emerging Economies. Clearly, it was issuing zero carbon directives from the British elite to developing countries. But in this crisis, what is Chatham House? It's the platform from which the RIIA Ukraine Affairs Director, Orysia Lutsevich, and the British Foreign Affairs Minister, Liz Truss, issued threats and calls for British troops to deploy immediately to the front lines in Ukraine. And the International Energy Agency, the IEA, which is the so-called energy agency which constantly projects zero carbon energy production worldwide. What is that? Well, it's now headed by an official of the World Economic Forum, the Davos Forum. His name is Fatih Birol. But it was formed in December 1973 on the initiative of the same Henry Kissinger. It was formed to advise nations on policies related to their energy mix. And where did Kissinger hatch this plan and start the IEA? At a meeting of the Pilgrim Society of London, which was full of the likes of Lord Carrington, George Shultz, Alexander Haig, Caspar Weinberger, Margaret Thatcher, Henry Luce. The U.S. Secretary of State was always an ex officio member of the Pilgrim Society of London. It's quite a place to launch a global energy policy body. It makes it very clear it was an imperial energy resources dictator body. Antony Blinken, the U.S. Secretary of State, Harley has already mentioned, he rushed out to brief the media in the minutes after the Biden-Putin December 7th video conference, and he rushed out there with a much more warlike version of the results of that video conference than subsequently came from President Biden himself. Now, this is Antony Blinken. Earlier this year, the London Financial Times ran an interview with him and headlined it this way: Blinken says U.S. must lead green energy revolution to combat China. So this Glasgow World Climate Summit was an admitted failure. That was unexpected as recently as when President Biden supposedly had a successful pre-climate summit back in April. But this one failed. Why? Because of the refusal of Russia and China to entertain economy-wrecking zero-carbon pledges that stiffened the anti-Malthusian resistance of the developing countries, in particular India, to this climate colonialism. That was the phrase of the Bolivian President Arce, or it might be called climate imperialism, of Prince Charles, of the London central banker Mark Carney, of Sir Michael Bloomberg, the European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, and so on. And when that conference ended in failure at Glasgow, President Biden then angrily called out President Xi and President Putin. He said they would have to answer to the world for not showing up at Glasgow. And then he announced a steel agreement with von der Leyen on behalf of the European Union or the European Commission. This was explicitly to keep Chinese steel out of Europe. Now, and replace it with U.S. exports of U.S. steel. Now, steel in the United States now is produced overwhelmingly by the electric arc furnace method, meaning that it is produced from the scrap of previously produced steel. It has a low carbon content relative to steel produced by blast furnace methods. And in fact, that low carbon content makes it inferior as to long-term durability, as to the flexibility of its temper, and in other ways, it is inferior to higher carbon content blast furnace produced steel with the most modern blast furnace methods. So Biden and von der Leyen were agreeing that the European Union would take a hostile act against China, shut out Chinese higher quality steel exports, and replace them with lower quality U.S. steel exports, calling the former dirty steel and the latter clean steel. This would be funny if it were not directly lowering the productivity of the economies that take these kinds of steps. At the same time, the European Union abruptly put off, again, in the wake of the failure of this conference, they put off the licensing of the completed Nord Stream 2 pipeline from Russia to Germany for a year, despite winter gas shortages in Europe, prices already sky high in Europe, and actual day-to-day shortages developing there. Now, at that summit, Prince Charles, who delivered the keynote, demanded a, quote, vast military-style campaign to marshal the strength of the global private sector to achieve fundamental green economic transition, unquote. Then immediately the Ukraine and Taiwan tensions were geared up hard and fast, but that was not the only shift by the London and Wall Street banks and the billionaires and the British royals behind this green reset, driving this Green New Deal. The other shift was that the Green Deal demands on the economies of the transatlantic and of the developing sector suddenly became far more extreme despite their defeat. The IEA, again, this Kissinger-created body, which puts out an annual World Economic Outlook, in its latest World Economic Outlook, made the incredible claim that 95% of all additions to electric power capacity in the world over the next 5 years will be wind, solar, and biomass. That means wood chips. 95%. That they claim that 4,800 gigawatts, or 4,800,000 megawatts of interruptible and unreliable power sources like these would be added to in the world as a whole by 2030, in less than 10 years. At the same time, the new German government set a target that Germany's power capacity would consist 80% in wind and solar by 2040, and it is now shutting down 3 of its last 6 nuclear reactors. The German economist and former minister Heiner Flassbeck responded to this, saying that Germany will be 100,000 megawatts short of power every day at midday by 2040 if it does this, and already 80,000 megawatts short every day at midday by 2030 under this policy. If this kind of economic return to the 17th century, which the IEA was forecast, were actually to be imposed in the next 5 years, undeveloped nations which buckled down to it would be in total turmoil, in starvation and poverty. China would, of course, be leading the Belt and Road member nations in the opposite nuclear power-led direction, and the opposition of Russia to this would be implacable, and its nuclear power strengths would be available to other nations. That's not to speak of space exploration and other central scientific frontiers, that gap that would be open. So this Green Deal flight forward after the failure of its global climate summit includes a demand for domination, including military domination over national forces that oppose it. But we don't even have to look at this IEA caricature of the next 5 years. The mere first approximation of it so far have caused economic chaos and rampant inflation driven by energy and other commodity prices. And here are some aspects of that. Spending on fossil fuel extraction investments worldwide, which averaged roughly $700 billion per year for the first half of the last decade, suddenly fell to $450 billion a year from 2016 to 2019 on average, and to $300 billion a year in 2020, 2021, less than half of the level of just 5 years earlier. That's according to the U.S. Energy Information Administration, EIA, nothing to do with the IEA that I was talking about yesterday. Global coal power generation dropped by 14% in the past 5 years, by 10% in the past 2 years alone. Labor shortages have resulted in the fossil fuel industries from the impact of the zero carbon propaganda against them, that impact on younger workers who are avoiding these industries, as articles in Reuters and the Financial Times reported simultaneously on November 30th. Fossil fuels are now in global shortage. This also ricochets. Because of the huge increases in the prices of natural gas around the world, fertilizers have become unaffordable or, in some cases, unavailable to farmers in countries all over the world. World wheat output is set to drop by 10 million tons next year, according to the French agricultural analysis firm Agritel. Corn production costs are rising to 15 to 20% in the major producers, United States and Ukraine. One of the world's top fertilizer firms, CF Industries, projects lower yields of many foods and agricultural products all around the world in 2022. So amid widespread famines already in 2020 and 21, and the loss of informal agricultural work in the developing countries, food is entering global shortage in 2022. Electric power reserve margins are already in global shortage, as blackouts and grid emergencies in the United States and Germany have already shown. Labor productivity in the United States and the EU economies plunged during the course of 2021. In the United States, for example, down 1.1% in the second quarter, down another 5.2% in the third quarter, down 1.6% for the year ending in September. This kind of drop in raw labor productivity is very rare. Inflation in November officially, and this is meaning in an understated manner, reached 5.2% annual in Europe, 6.8% annual in the United States, at which point the Bureau of Labor Statistics in the United States announced, if we could have another moment of levity here, the Labor Department announced that as of January of this coming year, it is going to change the means by which it computes inflation. So, although they were unable to make inflation transitory, they are going to make the definition of inflation transitory and see how far they can get with that. But real wages are falling, both in Europe and in the United States. In the United States, they have dropped, for example, by just under 2% over the past year for all employees in the economy. The largest banks in the United States and London and in European capitals are in a zombie condition due to the vast money printing of the central banks in the past 2 years and the enlistment of these banks by the Great Reset elite to what they call shift the trillions out, or force the shifting of the trillions out of all carbon-intense economic activity. These banks have become unwilling or unable or both to loan. They now typically have 75 to 100% more deposits on hand than loans, and they are withdrawing credit from the industrial economies, not putting it in, but withdrawing it month by month, lowering productive investment and productivity. So this is a situation where financial elites enlist media and government to generate anger, even hatred of, quote, adversary nations, in a situation where crises then are developed, are promoted, and in one way or another, as in the case of the inadvertent but nearly completely disastrous Cuban Missiles Crisis 60 years ago, they lead towards war. This alone should lead us to fight this Green New Deal until it has been stopped and reversed by economic development policies, in particularly those directed toward the developing countries and involving the cooperation of the major leading technological nations. So thanks for the having me on, and that's what I'll say for now until the discussion.
Yeah, thank you very much, Paul. We're going to have several things. Harley, we've already got several questions for you, and I know your time is somewhat limited. So let me first just ask if you have any response to what you heard from Paul, or if you have anything to say about what we played from Lynn vis-a-vis the issue of the democratic systems.
Well, I very much appreciated Paul's report because it does fill out the picture, which I referred to, which is the implosion of the financial system, which is underlying the move toward a new realm of geopolitical provocation and confrontation. On Lynn's comments, this is a very powerful conception. I mean, the whole idea of democracy was attacked very effectively by Plato in the Republic as a system which can lead to tyranny, the tyranny of public opinion, in other words, of manipulation. And this is something that Lynn brought up from the time I met him in early 1971 throughout his life, that the difference between a Republican system in which you have a presidency which represents the interests of the general welfare of the entire population is different from a democracy. And it only works, as Lynn pointed out in that excerpt, the second excerpt you showed, when each citizen takes responsibility for the outcome of policy. And I think this is the point that Mrs. LaRouche has been emphasizing, that you may think you're just one person, but every person who speaks out and raises the question of the hypocrisy and the insanity of this war doctrine, of the Green New Deal, of the Great Reset, every person who speaks out becomes an important figure in shaping an opposition, and more importantly, not just an opposition, but building the kind of dialogue in the population so that we can get alternative policies through. So instead of being a pessimist and thinking there's nothing you can do, we're dependent on whether Biden is going to do decent things or not, and of course, if you're dependent on Biden, forget it. No, it's the individual citizen's responsibility. So I just thought that was very powerful, and I'm very happy that you included that in the program today.
Okay, there's a question for you, and it is in conjunction with a statement I want to read from Ray McGovern. It goes right to what you were just saying. The question, which is from Kathy, is: can you discuss the relationship of the British Empire effort to try Julian Assange under the U.S. Espionage Act, especially with the British High Court ruling to extradite him this week, to the war effort against Russia and China? The relationship of the two things. Now, that's the question. Now, Ray McGovern, in a statement that he released today, and he sends his regards to us all. He would have been with us today, but cannot do that for health reasons. His statement says, is called "Vengeance is Ours, Saith the Agency." And a portion of the statement, Ray McGovern, just so people are clear, is the co-founder of Veterans Intelligence Professionals for Sanity and was a CIA analyst for over 27 years. So he says, Assange's lawyers have said they intend to appeal the high court decision. But, as Glenn Greenwald pointed out, quote, today's victory for the United States means that Assange's freedom, if it ever comes, is further away than ever. Not months, but years, even under the best of circumstances, end quote. That, of course, has been the plan for a decade or more. Greenwald also noted that post-Obama Democrats and their security state allies have a particularly potent reason to exact vengeance on Assange, who published those DNC emails showing that Bernie Sanders was cheated out of the nomination in 2016. Add the indignity suffered by the CIA when an insider apparently leaked a treasure trove of unique documents on cyber warfare. WikiLeaks promptly published parts of Vault 7, the family jewels of offensive cyber tools in which the CIA and NSA has invested billions. The security state had a witch's brew. And then in conclusion in his statement, subtitle is "The Truth Will Always Win." He says, this saying of Julian's, "The truth will always win," is one that we strong supporters are determined to hang on to and believe, even when it stretches credulity. Throwing in the towel is not an option. Okay, the response.
Okay, to the question on the relationship between the British role with Assange and the relationship to the war drive, you can't talk about the endless wars without discussing the incestuous relationship between British intelligence and the CIA and the other U.S. institutions created after World War II. The attempt to bring the United States into a British imperial colonial strategy after World War II could only occur after the death of Franklin Roosevelt, who, during his leadership in the war, was adamantly opposed to the whole British Empire strategy for the post-war period. Now, without going through the whole history, if you just look at the most recent events, you find that in every crucial turning point in U.S. foreign policy, there was a British strategic plan before the U.S. moved in that direction. Take, for example, the importance of the Kennedy assassination. John Kennedy was moving against the British strategy, which was to continue the geopolitical divide between East and West. And after the Cuban Missile Crisis, Kennedy was looking for an opportunity, first through back channels and then through direct negotiations around a détente policy, to break with the British policy. Because the British policy, as enunciated by Churchill and forced on Truman, was the Iron Curtain, the battle between two empires. You just follow that through. Look at 9/11, the cover-up of the Saudi role, where the Saudis have always functioned as a British deployment. Look at the role of Sir Richard Dearloffe in providing the so-called evidence of Saddam's weapons of mass destruction, which was taken by Colin Powell to the UN Security Council. Look at the joint support of terrorists. In Syria, the role of the British agencies, both in the media and also the white helmets, claiming that it was Assad who was gassing his people, when in fact it was a cover for the terrorists who were being trained and armed by the US and the British. And these continuing false flag operations. Look at the Afghan War. This is a perfect example of the great game, which was the British policy in the middle of the 19th century, as a war against the Russian Empire. And it continued to the present day as a geopolitical driving force of British policy. And their desperate efforts to engage the United States in this. And how did they eventually do it? Through Brzezinski. in the Carter administration in the 77-78 period, when Brzezinski launched a plan which was really the Bernard Lewis plan. Bernard Lewis was a high-level British intelligence officer who had this idea, which was essentially the clash of civilizations, which came to the U.S. through Samuel Huntington, through the William Yandell Elliott Kindergarten at Harvard, and Brzezinski, who said, we have to bring basically set a trap for the Soviets in Afghanistan, through which we can then arm and create an Islamic fundamentalist movement to bring down the Soviet Empire and bring down China. And that's what was launched with the 9/11 attacks that led to the never-ending wars in the Middle East. And then just one final note, there was Russiagate. When we had an elected president, Donald Trump, who came to office saying he wanted to be friends with Putin, he wanted to work with China, he wanted to end these endless wars. And we had Russiagate, the absolutely fraudulent charge that Putin was working with Trump, colluding with Trump, blackmailing Trump, which is what the FBI and the media consistently said during Russiagate, to try to undermine, and in fact successfully undermine, an effort to establish a cooperative relationship between the U.S. and Russia. So every single step of the way, we see the U.S. On the British game plan of geopolitics. Now, Assange was a crucial thorn in their side because he took the documents delivered to him. He didn't hack them. He didn't commit a crime to get the documents. These were documents from U.S. military, which, by the way, later the Washington Post had similar documents in, I think, 2019, 2020, published their own Afghan papers. No one in the Washington Post is sitting in Belmarsh prison for that. But the targeting of Assange was because he, in 2009, 2010, demonstrated the war crimes being committed by the United States on this British game plan of the Great Game in Central Asia. And ultimately, what's the point of this Great Game? To prevent a potential alliance between Western European countries, Central European countries, and Eurasian countries. This is what Putin and Xi Jinping are trying to accomplish, is a cooperative relationship between East and West. That's what the Belt and Road Initiative is. That's what the initiatives of Lyndon and Helga Zepp-LaRouche have been, to create that cooperation. While the British strategy is always to prevent, and this goes back to Mackinder and the creation of geopolitics, prevent a working relationship between Western Europe, Central Europe, and Eurasia. And so that's why the Assange question is, to some extent, a reflection of the continuing commitment of the British Foreign Service, the British monarchy, the British intelligence community, to the geopolitical game plan, and the extent to which they have made dominant inroads through the universities in the West, such as Harvard, Georgetown, and others, through the think tanks, and through the media, and through the corporate conglomerates and the cartels that make U.S. policy. So that's as simply as I can present that, but that's absolutely the case.
Okay, very good. What I'm going to do is I'm going to pose two questions, because they're directed to each of you, but I want to, in both the interest of time and also I think completeness. So one is from Cade. This is the first question. Question number one. Given the threat of nuclear war, is now a time for a renewed advocacy of the SDI, as some Russian diplomats have seemed to suggest? Could this be done in conjunction with the World Health System and expansion of the Belt and Road Initiative into the World Land Bridge, perhaps under the banner of FDR's original conception for the United Nations? Okay, so that's the whole question. Can this be done in the way that we said, under the banner of FDR's original conception? Second question is from Marie. The question is, while I fully support and agree with the fact that we cannot ignore the real possibility of nuclear war, within the current scene, with all the coordinated and orchestrated actions which would, quote, justify this happening accidentally or not, the war happening. What can we as individuals do to take action? Okay, so that's the second question. So Paul, you want to start?
Let me just check that I'm not mute. You can hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, okay. The SDI, that's a very interesting question, whether it could be revived. I would say the fundamental principle of it, yes. The specific agreements that Lyndon LaRouche proposed at that time between the United States and the Soviet Union for the scientists from both sides, as Reagan said, to develop technologies that make nuclear weapons impotent and obsolete, that would have to be changed because of technological developments, progress, and other things since. It's I think the best way to go at it is to remember that Lyndon LaRouche, in that same period when he prevailed in getting the SDI, his SDI idea circulated and accepted, if not funded, but accepted and adopted by the Reagan administration, he subordinated it to the policy of joint colonization of space by the major spacefaring powers, which at that time, of course, still meant the United States and the Soviet Union. He consistently said that the development of technologies in the path of a 40 to 50 year mission to settle the moon and travel to Mars at more than hypervelocities in the traveling to Mars in order to make it human, that mission, including the real development of the surface of the moon as a part of the noosphere in which the human race would be existing and living and developing, those guidelines for scientific and technological progress, LaRouche always said, were the dominant ones. And the SDI was essentially something located within that the possibilities for the use of directed energy beams at that time had gone far enough that a crash program of development to bring them into use against nuclear missiles could work. And it could only work if its aim was really a laser industrial revolution worldwide. Lynn made very detailed and eloquent presentations about what a laser industrial worldwide revolution would mean, in particular for the developing countries. And people rallied behind that at the time. Now, I think the agreement would have to start from the top, that is from the level of cooperation in the exploration of space, clearly involving now the United States, Russia, China, and India at least. Those are very dynamic space programs. In the case of China's and India's, really more dynamic than that of the United States. But the collaboration amongst them, number one, could take off the table the threat of warfare in space, and number two, could be focused on preventing war on the planet Earth with nuclear missiles and defending the Earth from the other threats which are well known, but about which really very little has been done. That is, the threats from extraterrestrial objects, meteorites, large meteorites, asteroids, comets, the threat of striking the Earth and the tremendous damage they can do, and the threat of EMP from very large solar flares as well. The defense of Earth, strategic defense of Earth, first put forward from the Russian side in the 1990s, the early 1990s, that began to be the evolution of, consciously, of Lyndon LaRouche's idea of the SDI. So it definitely can and should be put forward and fought for now, but it comes at us from within the need for cooperation in the development and exploration of space, particularly Moon, Mars missions, and what was called the strategic defense of Earth. I hope that would answer the question. On what we can ask, on what we can do as individuals, I was trying to indicate there just at the end, if you think, as Oliver Stone did in his interview of JFK, JFK in the Cuban Missiles Crisis was determined to avert nuclear war, despite how close that came to it, which was really very, very close. But because a president like him, as committed as he was to scientific progress, to economic strength, to the economic development of this country and other countries, simply would not allow a crisis to go to nuclear war. His commitments to progress would make him prevent that. We may not have leaders like that in the transatlantic world now. I would say we definitely don't. But we are recruiting and organizing, this movement, is recruiting and organizing leaders at every level, from the national to the very local, and within constituency groups who do have this commitment, in order to put the upward pressure on the existing national leaders and make them place development in front of war. And that's the whole purpose of what we're talking about now, and what Helga LaRouche proposed in Modern Health System for Every Nation, the concentration right now on Afghanistan, and preventing the death by starvation and cold of millions of people in Afghanistan, and beginning the development of modern health and public health facilities in that country and among the developing countries generally. When we get leaders who think that way, at whatever level they are determined to prevent strategic crises from coming to nuclear war, and they will act in whatever way they can to stop that. And that's the duty of the citizen. It's what we're doing through our movement here. And as I was trying to indicate, fighting the Green New Deal, which is a goad to war between the Malthusian countries which adopt Malthusian policies and ruin themselves in the process, and those which don't. Defeating that Green New Deal is a part of this responsibility.
Okay, Harley?
Yeah, I would just like to start by saying, for those who don't know this, Paul's answer on the SDI was especially interesting, given the role that he played as with the Fusion Energy Foundation at the time, the 82, 83, 84, when Ronald Reagan announced the SDI. Paul was one of the people brought on national news the next morning to explain what the SDI is. So you got an answer from, you might say, the horse's mouth on the whole question of both the SDI as an original concept and the way it could be implemented today. Look, on the second question, this is the question I get all the time in the interviews I do, the work I do for outreach, and it's a very simple answer, although it's not so simple. The answer is be a citizen. Speak out, become educated, intervene. There's a growing awareness in the population that we're in a civilizational crisis, an existential crisis, whether it's the energy crisis, whether it's the collapse of education and culture, the opioid crisis. There's so many individual crises. And what people tend to do is they get divided into smaller and smaller groups with a very successful operation called identity politics. You divide people up around their pre-existing prejudices or beliefs, and you polarize the country so that there's no way to intervene on the broader strategic questions. That's why we insist you have to take these fights up on the highest level, the philosophical level, the scientific level, not left versus right or Democrats versus Republicans, liberals versus conservatives, blue state versus red state. That's a trap. But you have to address these higher issues. Now, there's not a more important issue than stopping nuclear war. But by making people think that either nuclear war is unthinkable and would never happen, or that there's nothing you can do about it, it's easier to divide people into these smaller and smaller identity groups and control them and get them caught up in issues that may be personally compelling. You know, if you're a parent, how your children are being miseducated is a very compelling issue. But if we have a nuclear war, you're not going to have a school system or children. So most of these issues fall short of the consequences of nuclear war. Now, what we're doing is we're setting up a series of working committees on these leading issues. What Paul mentioned, the Operation Ibn Sina launched by Helga Zepp-LaRouche to deal with the crisis in Afghanistan, which has a pathway for cooperation between the US, Russia, and China to stop the horrendous humanitarian destruction of a nation of almost 40 million people. On energy, defeating the Green New Deal. On economics, LaRouche's 4 laws. On the World Health System. These are all operational committees that have been set up, and I would urge people to get in contact with our offices, to get in contact with us, get the backup material you need to know about these things. And many of you already have some ideas on these things. Share your ideas with us, work with us, help us build this anti-Malthusian opposition to the unipolar world that otherwise will lead us into ultimately depression, collapse, and war.
If you have time for a final question, now you have to get going. We do have one from Kynan. Can you take it?
Yeah.
Okay, so here's what it is. As you have said, the Summit for Democracy recently launched this week in the name of protecting human rights, bolstering the democratic resilience, and preventing and countering corruption. That this is obviously nothing more than a masquerade to cover up the many abuses that have taken place in the past 20 years of failed Western geopolitical policies, most notably the criminal genocide now taking place in Afghanistan. I know recently that China has convened its own conference on democracy, and they have included many other nations so that they can present their own respective views on the subject rather than simply voice support for the rules-based order. What are China's views on democracy in comparison to the way the West views it, and can we implement some of their perspectives to change the way people view democracy in the United States and the West generally?
Well, let me answer that by referring people to a series of interviews done with Helga Zepp-LaRouche on Chinese television, where she's been asked questions about what's going on in the West, what's the policy. And one of the points she's been making is that the starting point for, let's just say, a system which has democratic rights for its population, as opposed to a so-called democracy, is one which respects the general welfare of its citizens. And in China, yes, it's a one-party system. There may be other parties that exist, but they're really dwarfed by the power of the Communist Party. But what is the Communist Party? How have they been able to gain support of the overwhelming majority of the Chinese people? It's not by force. It's by economic policy. It's by healthcare policy. It's by addressing the needs of its people. Now, is it perfect? No, but what they're saying is that democracy actually has to be a constantly developing system which addresses the general welfare of the population. And the fact that China has enacted an economic policy over 20 years that's lifted 800 million people out of poverty, whereas in the transatlantic region, the policies we've seen since 1971, but in particular since the 2007-2008 crisis, is driving increasing numbers of people from the so-called middle class into poverty, into desperate circumstances, and so on. That's a difference that should be reflected on. Doesn't mean a one-party system is what's needed. The Chinese basically are saying that every nation should find its own model. And the Chinese are saying they're willing to show what they're doing, but they're not trying to impose that model on other countries. And this is something with the Belt and Road Initiative, which has become quite popular in countries that are victims of years of colonial oppression, the International Monetary Fund conditionalities, credit cutoff, technological apartheid, and so on. And what the Chinese are saying is that you choose your own model, but we're there to help you with financial help, with technical help, with infrastructure development. That's the tradition of Franklin Roosevelt from the end of, that's what he intended at the end of World War II. That was the intent of the Kennedy approach to foreign policy, an anti-colonial development system that's based on the principles of the American system, which is credit not controlled by an oligarchy, but credit from a government which is intent on developing the productive powers of its population. And I think in a broad sense, that's what the Chinese mean when they talk about the Chinese model of democracy, a government which is committed to improving the circumstances of life for the majority of its people. Now, that's what you get promised, whether it's a Democrat or a Republican, every 2 years when there's an election. But what's the reality? Look at what they've done instead. And you see the shortfalls of the so-called democracy in the United States, which has replaced the traditional emphasis on a Republican system, which is based on constituent relationships with their elected representatives. So for more on this, again, you can go to, I think Paul may correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the LaRouche Pub, the Executive Intelligence Review, is going to have an article on Helga's comments on this in the next issue.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Harley. We know you have to get going, or may have to get going, and we think that was pretty comprehensive. Also, Paul will be able to take up various of the matters. There are some other questions that have come in, but thanks a lot for being with us today.
All right. See you again.
Very, very good. Next, what we're going to do, Paul, I got something. We have an interview that was done by Jose Vega with Admiral Mark Pelaez. Mark is a retired Rear Admiral of the U.S. Navy. And he also was Chief of Naval Research at the Office of Naval Research from 1993 to 96. And Mark is responding to questions that were posed by Jose to him, which were intended to sort of respond to what some of the very dangerous things that are being discussed right now, from the standpoint of someone in the American military who served and knows something about the implications of what's being discussed. So we're going to go to that, and then want to ask your comment on it, as Paul, as Harley indicated, because of both your previous role with the FEF, the Fusion Energy Foundation, about which we might want to even say a little bit. But we'll run this first, and then we'll come back to you.
My name is Mark Pelaez. And so my first career, 28 years in the Navy, I was retired as a Rear Admiral, and I commanded nuclear submarines, amongst other things. I retired as Chief of Naval Research.
Okay, so when you say you commanded nuclear submarines, what does that mean exactly? Why? And I'm going to be asking.
Okay. So when you, so I was a line officer, active duty, and had a number of assignments on submarines. Started out as a junior officer, was engineer of another submarine, junior officer on a ballistic missile submarine, engineer of an attack submarine, executive officer of a ballistic missile submarine, and I commanded an attack submarine. And they have different missions.
Okay, right. See, didn't know that because, you know,
Yeah, I figured. Yeah.
My understanding of history was what I learned in high school was that during the Cold War, you had submarines on both sides of the Soviet Union and the Americans, and at any moment, you know, the button could be pressed, and then that'd be it for everyone and everything. But I don't know if I got an accurate understanding of the power of exactly what that meant. How destructive could these submarines be?
Well, I mean, to put it in perspective, so each of the missiles on the submarine has multiple nuclear warheads, and each one much stronger than those that were used at the end of World War II. So a single missile could hit multiple targets along the coast. Basically, one submarine could take out most major cities east of the Mississippi River, for instance, one submarine. So it's a huge and awesome responsibility. It's not something that can be easily done. It can't be done by one person. It takes many people in the chain to recognize that it's valid and to take that action. But yes, the destructive power is enormous.
Wow. So somebody who's actually on the submarine, and if they get the order to attack, what do they expect is going to happen to them? Are they just ready for a counterattack? Do they think that they're going to get out of there alive, or is that it?
Well, first of all, you know, the advantage of our nuclear submarines are that they're really not detectable. Nobody knows where they are. Even our own commanders don't know exactly where they are. Only the submarine knows where it is, and because they have large swaths of ocean that they operate in. So it's not so much that you're concerned that somebody's going to immediately put a weapon on top of you, unless you were there's another submarine nearby, enemy submarine perhaps could take you out because you make a lot of noise when you launch. But other than that, no, the real issue is there'd be nothing left to go back to. So it's not something that you're always prepared for, but the whole concept of mutually assured destruction was designed to be a very stabilizing force, so that both sides understood there was nothing to be gained by deploying those weapons, that everybody loses. So to be a credible threat, though, you have to be willing to execute.
So could you say you could get, in terms of you're saying they're pretty much undetectable. So how close could you get to another major country without it being detected? Could you get pretty close?
Well, yeah, but not that you need to.
Right.
Yes, you could, but in fact, that's not where you'd want to operate, because you put yourself in more danger. There are more likelihood of being detected. So you operate in large open ocean areas.
Okay. So you were talking about mutually assured destruction, and you were saying that that's, you know, an effective means of, hey, nobody wins in this situation. What do you make of Senator Wicker saying, well, we can preemptively use nuclear bombs to deter Russia from entering Ukraine? Is that actually an effective strategy? Is that just talk? What is that?
Yeah, to me, it's just talk from somebody who really doesn't understand the national security implications and the reality of how we operate. So no, I give it no credibility at all. We have never espoused a first strike, ever. It's not been part of our doctrine. It's not the way we operate. And to even talk about things like that is destabilizing, in my opinion, and doesn't help resolve conflicts or situations that can be resolved by the right sort of dialogue, negotiation, understanding the other side's interests, etc. But no, it's not helpful, in my opinion. It's political rhetoric.
That seems like some pretty crazy political rhetoric to just,
Yeah, I don't know who he's playing it to. I mean, it's not something that obviously even, the administration is even thinking about. It doesn't make sense. If people really believe you would take first strike in a conflict, that destabilizing factor really complicates negotiations, really makes the world a less safe place. So it's nothing that we've ever supported.
Okay. Well, I guess that's a little relieving to know. I don't know. It just strikes me that it's insanity that a senator would even say that, not necessarily just to his people, but also to the public, and say, yeah, we're not ruling that out.
Yeah, I understand about not ruling out some things, but then to add a comment about first strike nuclear, that makes no sense to me.
Right. And so why do you think then that it's been, I guess, since the fall of the wall in 1989, it's been almost 30 years now. And why is it that nuclear bombs are still being mentioned today, despite the fact that we're supposedly not in a Cold War anymore? I mean, why use that as a scare tactic to bully other countries?
Well, we don't use it as a scare tactic. I think the concept that if we are attacked, we have the ability to respond appropriately. As I said, that doctrine of mutually assured destruction exists today, but it's not a scare tactic. It's meant as an insurance policy, so a rogue country doesn't engage in that sort of practice and think that they could attack the United States without consequences. But I wouldn't characterize it from our national security interest as a scare tactic. We have the capability and we're restrained in its use. We would use it if we had to, but it's only a last resort.
Okay, so then what does counterintelligence look like in the naval field? Because you were saying these submarines are pretty much undetectable. Now, when it comes to the opposition's submarines, is that true for theirs as well? We only have, I guess we could say maybe they might be somewhere in this grid here, in this quadrant here, but we really can't say where they are exactly.
Look, the Russians, to some extent the Chinese, their submarines are more and more capable. Obviously, it's more difficult, so it's a constant game of trying to decide how best to detect a submarine. But submarines are difficult to detect. And that's just a reality. Our submarines are extremely quiet and have been very successful in detecting other submarines. We have other assets with our surface forces and air, but it's still a difficult, very difficult, and more challenging, every year, more challenging situation. Some of it was some of our technology and some of the, back in the 80s even, there were several spies that gave up a number of our techniques and technology. So that enabled advances in other countries' submarines. But it's a fact of life. It's like technology has changed. It's a constantly evolving thing. It's what the U.S. trains for instance, detecting other submarines and being in a position perhaps to prevent a nuclear strike if that were to happen. But again, very difficult.
Paul, Yeah, okay, yeah, I'm sorry. We're going to do is we have a couple more questions, and because of time, we're going to get to those questions. Although, even from that, let me see, Paul, if you have a response to what you heard Admiral Pelaez said. I understand he has a section at the end on Ukraine per se. We may try to get to that for time, but I just want to get your response and then make sure I get to these other questions. Go ahead.
He's like the Admiral Pelaez is like the I think the great majority of American military figures, particularly those who get command, in that he's extremely interested in making sure the United States can be defended, but he's not interested in war as such. He's not interested in particular in offensive war at all. And this where this has persisted through decades in which the United States has repeatedly engaged in offensive war below the nuclear threshold, but offensive wars which could trigger upwards, going all the way back to the overthrow of the president of Iran in 1953, where we did not invade and the British did not invade, but both countries were ready to do so if the coup had required it. And then in Guatemala we invaded, in Vietnam we invaded, in Syria we invaded, in Afghanistan we invaded, in Libya we bombed, and so on and so forth. Yet this healthy attitude persists, but the United States does not have a firm commitment to no first strike. It maintains a certain ambiguity deliberately, but I think more importantly, in the last real nuclear war crisis in 1962 over Cuba, where the Soviet Union had placed nuclear capable missiles there, capable of striking the United States, the top leadership of the American military wanted to make a first strike, not a non-nuclear first strike, perhaps, but nonetheless, they wanted to make a first strike on Cuba. And when the SDI, when we became really intensively involved in the mobilization which got the Reagan administration to adopt Lynn's general outline of the SDI, it was because things in Europe had come, the offensive launching sites for nuclear missiles were coming so close to their targets, and we see this again now, is a major issue over Ukraine and other NATO nations which are right on the border of Russia. The launchers were getting so close to their targets that first strike in the form of a launch on warning, which could be mistaken, could be correct, could be wrong, that was clearly possible. And then the intensive development of the technologies of the laser revolution at that time needed to be done in a crash program to see if that could be stopped. And nuclear submarines, of course, were the most difficult problem for a directed energy beam anti-missile defense. Defending against the nuclear submarines was the most difficult thing by far. But Lynn's view was this kind of crash program will immediately change the world because of the directed energy beam technologies, relativistic beam technologies, what he called the laser industrial revolution, can be spread to all countries, developing countries included. And that in itself is a path to peace. So that was the importance of it then, and I think in terms of the importance of it now, we already discussed that in the previous, there was a previous question where we already discussed that.
Okay, I understand that we have a 2-minute section on Ukraine from Admiral Pelaez, so let's play that, and then we'll return to 2 questions which we have for you, Paul, and then we'll be at our conclusion. So go ahead.
Ukraine, NATO, and NATO expanding eastward, and what should be done?
So I think, there's, and obviously some of those other comments that were made by the senator and other people out there, all related to this current situation. Yeah, my personal view, and again, I'm not a foreign policy expert, so let me just tell you, it's my view, my understanding. But as I look at it, I'm happy to see that there's dialogue going on between the President Biden, Putin, on this subject. Now, my view is that there is a big concern on Russia's part that NATO would expand into the Ukraine. It's a significant incursion into what was the former Soviet Union. It's really, in terms of strategic placement, it's much closer to all their assets. So I wouldn't be surprised they didn't consider it somewhat, if we were to do that, somewhat like, we did back in the 60s with, it's a different situation, but with missiles in Cuba, for instance, too close to us. And so my guess is all the placement of troops, et cetera, is designed to get some assurances that that expansion of NATO and perhaps the deployment of weapons by NATO into the Ukraine won't happen. That's what I believe.
Okay, fine. Any response on that, Paul? You want me to go to the questions?
No, I clearly, I agree. I was saying much the same thing, and that kind of a placement of nuclear weapons in Ukraine would virtually amount to a first strike, and I think the Admiral was expressing that in a way.
Okay, very good. So there are two questions. The first is from Adam, and it is, how can the British people stop the war policy agenda of the British political oligarchy in the interests of global peace and cooperation? How can the British people stop the war policy agenda of the British political oligarchy? The second question is from Isa. She asked this. She says, I'm continually surprised to learn that so many people understand the increasing war threat, yet stay transfixed on the idea that the only way we can combat this is to clean out Washington, D.C., or have a number of people in office. Other than pointing to the examples of unelected leaders like Martin Luther King and their successes, how do we convince people that an international organization like ours is capable of real change? That's her question.
If you don't mind, I'll deal with, I'd like to talk about the second question. We have just a little time, and we work with, on the first, we work with individuals and small organizations, but nonetheless who have a certain reach in England, in the British Isles. There are many there who are opposed to the geopolitical division of the world policy, which the British elite have been carrying out for a very long time. And I might say that I think the British royals and the British financial elite more generally are now trying to get around those people with a supposedly new campaign, that is the Green New Deal, the zero carbon end of fossil fuels campaign. And we need to work with anybody we can there in the fight against that Green New Deal as well. It's nobody can answer your question exactly or predict exactly what the British people have to do. And that does pretty much get us into the second question. It doesn't depend on, well, I think the questioner has raised it in terms of defense, prevention of war, particularly prevention of world war. It doesn't depend on electing or throwing out a dozen or several dozen people from the Congress, primarily. it depends on the organization of citizens, what Martin Luther King called, and people before him also called, creative nonviolent civil disobedience, which is simply a way of citizens who have been denied rights, citizens who have perhaps been denied rights across the board and victimized, organizing to get their rights while at the same time rejecting the method of violent suppression which took away their rights, so that they set an example for the rest of the citizenry in what happens to them, what they ask for and what happens to them. It's the principle of petitioning of the government by the population, but it has to be citizens who fill a certain qualification, and one that Lynn LaRouche and others talked about, qualification that they themselves must be implicitly ready to have the reins of government in their hands and to know what to do and to do it fairly and to do it with regard to the truth as well as with regard to the common welfare, which is their North Star directing them. If they're prepared to do that and they're not concerning themselves with me and my family are it, but rather have taken at least the rest of the population, better the world population, as their family, whose welfare they must defend. If they're thinking on that level and thinking hard and qualifying themselves to govern, in effect, then they are able to organize in this way without any recourse to violence, without thinking that the United States has to solve this or that problem by attacking this or that country, or by starting a war between two other countries, which is the way the British think about it, but rather they think about it as something which is simply transforming the self-governing capabilities of the American people or the people of any other country. That's the way we go at it, and under the leadership of Lyndon LaRouche, that was always the way that his movement was organized. It really began in a serious way after some real breakthroughs on his part individually, when he was really vindicated in his forecast of the crisis in 1971 and the end of the Bretton Woods system, and suddenly became prominent and even notorious, you might say, among economists. As a result, he had to look to the qualities of leadership of the people who were joining his movement. He organized them first into an intelligence system based on the need to know economically and to a certain extent politically what was happening in every country of the world, what were the sources of conflicts, what were the potentials for cooperation, to know those, to be ready to act on them at such a point when we could. He was in that way preparing citizens of the kind that I'm talking about. That's what we're trying to do today when we say, as Helga did, what must be done with regard to Afghanistan. She was really saying 2 years ago what must be done with regard to the pandemic as well, and that modern health system in every nation. 2 years later, the latest report of the WHO still finds that not a single country in the world is prepared for the next pandemic, whatever it may be. So when she made that call, she was at the same time calling on everybody working with us to fill that out. What does it actually take to build a modern health system and public health system in every country of the world? What else do you have to do? Who do you have to cooperate with among the nations of the world to do that? This is the way a citizen has to think, and we have gotten by now many, many constituency leaders and leaders of organizations to think about that problem and to join in the Committee on the Coincidence of Opposites that she and Jocelyn and Elders started, and to make their own efforts in order to get this done and get it done in Afghanistan immediately. So that's, I think, the as I was trying to do with the example of JFK, when people are thinking that way on all different levels in a country, then that country is not likely to take actions which lead to world war.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Paul, for being with us today. I want to thank Harley Schneider, of course, as well. I think for the conclusion, I want to pick up on what you were just saying about JFK, because it seems to me that the strategic dynamic that we're really looking at is that of either October of 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis, or November of 1989, when the Berlin Wall came down, to much to the surprise of everyone, without a shot being fired. There were no nuclear weapons that were launched between the Warsaw Pact and NATO on that occasion. And in fact, many countries changed, many transformations occurred. It's also true, however, that only not even a year later, Secretary of State Baker did assert to Gorbachev that NATO would not expand 1 inch eastward after that. And in fact, some 17 nations joined NATO after that, and many of them very far eastward. So the dynamic that we're in is one that requires people to think the unthinkable, whether that means to think things which are unthinkably horrible or things that are unthinkably great and important. We have to take counsel of our fears, not our imagination. And this week, our imagination has been stretched by a new sighting in space. And various newspapers are reporting it in various ways. Could I have the first graphic? This one says, planet 10 times the size of Jupiter discovered when it shouldn't even exist. And this is the way in which this has been covered by various people. Huge planet found orbiting 2 of the universe's hottest and biggest stars. So not one sun, 2 suns together. And those 2 stars are about 6 times the size of our sun and 3 times as hot. And so the assumption was that, as the article written in The Hill stated, scientists recently discovered a planet orbiting around 2 stars previously thought to be too hot for a planet to exist around. And so it says it challenges our existing ideas of how planets form. But this is not the first time our ideas have been challenged in that way. Next graphic, please. You also have the case of going on the other end of the scale. Scientists discovered Jupiter-sized planet orbiting a tiny white dwarf star. That is a star, a sun, which is way too small, it's thought, to have a planet the size of our Jupiter orbiting it, because the magnetic field should be too weak, and other things, which we don't have to go into here, should be true. But they're not true. We can say that these things shouldn't be there, but they are there. And our imagination simply has to stretch to comprehend them or apprehend them. There's no such thing either in nature, in politics, or in culture as equilibrium. There's no such thing as successfully balancing through a balance of terror, mutually ensured destruction. These things, yes, you can do it for a while, but not really. There's nothing permanent, nothing durable about this. There is, however, the possibility of peace through development. There is a possibility of changing the physical conditions of the human race. And when you look at something like what has been proposed and is being implemented now by our organization in the form of what's called the World Health Platform, and the strategic idea called Operation Ibn Sina, which is an idea for the engagement of military forces, the forces of Russia, of China, of India, the forces, for that matter, of Pakistan and India, the forces in a different way of Iran, not as military forces, however. But these are countries that all have military forces, and in that area of Afghanistan in particular, which is Southwest Asia and is also the area of centuries old, even millennia old conflict, something new has to be invented, something which is mutual and assured survival. When you look at the scale of what we don't know, that we see displayed to us in deep space, and which challenges our ideas, our very premises for how we think about physical reality. It is a warning and a message that we have to think about ourselves in that larger context. One might say galactic context. You could even say intergalactic. This is not to say or think that this is above humanity. Is a problem that actually was refuted. It was an idea that was refuted by Dante Alighieri 700 years ago in his poem, The Commedia, the last part of which, the Paradiso, is all about and only about astronomical and philosophical questions at the highest order. The first part of the poem is about the most intricate, grimy, dirty, filthy concerns of humanity. And he skewers all of that. But that's not how he ends. He ends by taking an elaborate journey, which takes him to higher and higher orders of the heavens. But this is in the form of a dialogue that he has with Beatrice, the idealized but nonetheless real conception of human love and human knowledge, and of love of the divine. This idea of the divine in the sense of discovering, divining, the new solution, the new pathway, that is what our species has to do. That's what this organization talks about. And that's what we believe individual citizens have to begin to devote themselves to. It doesn't matter what you may have thought you signed up for, either when you were born or after you were born. The truth of the matter is that the circumstances that we find ourselves in today require that all who think of themselves as citizens think of themselves as citizens of the world. That doesn't mean that you're not from a nation. We are not opposed to the nation state by any means. In fact, it's largely through the vehicle of the nation state that these changes have to be mediated because of language, because of culture, and because of also initiatives. But we just like to say today that the conversation we are in requires people to not be afraid. About sometime around in the 1820s, Francisco Goya, the painter, made a picture of what he called well-known folly. And what it shows, and you're seeing it there on your screen, it's an etching, which shows a crowd being terrorized by this individual soldier with his saber up, and he's sort of protecting this figure. But if you look carefully, the figure seems to be a stick figure. If you look at the feet and you look at that arm, and yet the people seem to be completely terrified, except for that one figure in the front who is gesturing in, I think, a way that should make it clear what he's saying. His buttocks are turned to the soldier, and he has his hand to his mouth. It's his, say, kiss my tuchus, we'll say. That's the attitude that we hope that you, as an individual citizen, will take at this time toward the kind of crazy fake news, crazy media, and crazy ideas that are being circulated. But we also must understand, when we talk about somebody like Roger Wicker from Mississippi, let us not assume that that's just some nutty idea. Tulsi Gabbard and others have pointed out that no, this may very well be an attempt to float something. And the American people have to be very, very clear that as individuals and as an institution, we have to speak up and we have to speak out. We invite you all to join us in doing that. The LaRouche organization has been very, very clear about what its conception of this intervention should be. And we are very, very concerned that each citizen not think of themselves as powerless, but think of themselves as destined to play that role in history that Lyndon LaRouche indicated that to that audience now 36 years ago in 1985, that whether they chose to believe it or not, they had a role to play at that time, which actually was a role on behalf of 2,500 years of civilization. That's the role that people can choose to play at any time, but one has to see oneself as that kind of a citizen not merely of a nation, not merely of the world, but of history as well. And so on behalf of the LaRouche organization and our Manhattan town meeting, we want to thank you all for joining us today and hope that you can work with us, and we hope to see you here again next week.